Consider the subtleness of the sea, how its most dreaded creatures glide under water, unapparent for the most part, and treacherously hidden beneath the loveliest tints of azure. Consider also the devilish brilliance and beauty of many of its most remorseless tribes, as the dainty embellished shape of many species of sharks. Consider once more the universal cannibalism of the sea, all whose creatures prey upon each other, carrying on eternal war since the world began. Consider all this, and then turn to this green, gentle, and most docile earth. Consider them both, the sea and the land. And do you not find a strange analogy to something in yourself? For as this appalling ocean surrounds the verdant land, so in the soul of man there lies one insular Tahiti, full of peace and joy, but encompassed by all of the horrors of the half-known life. God keep thee, push not off from that isle, thou canst never return. So, I'm going to be giving, I guess what you'd call a review of Herman Melville's 1851 novel, classic, masterpiece, Moby Dick. I have a very nice Reader's Digest edition, which you can actually get very, very cheap now. And it's illustrated, and it's the unabridged edition, which I emphasize for people to get. But the word masterpiece, if it's to be used correctly, if at all, is Moby Dick. Moby Dick is the definition of a masterpiece. It's the definition of what a masterpiece in literature can do when literature is pushed to something which is quite literally beyond what is there at the time. It is almost like tapping into what Kant called the genius which comes in from the outside. There's something which just arrives and is, okay, now the stage is set. Now, calling this a review after almost 200 years, 1851, is sort of silly. So this is my own thoughts and reading and, what it means, right? What I think it means. I've split it into certain sections, which I'll go through. Plot, style, characters, and then meaning and reading. Now, the plot, quite jokingly, in a sentence, right? The plot is, it's a whaling novel. A certain man, Ishmael, goes whaling to find out what it's about. If you were to extend that for me to give the skeleton of the plot, and there is emphatically going to be spoilers throughout this, like serious spoilers. But once again, this book is most emphatically that notion of a journey, right? So the plot is, call me Ishmael. We are introduced to the narrator and the protagonist, the man who is telling a story which we understand to have been. And so in a certain sense, we as a reader, if we have a keen eye to a few little hints fairly early on, we are to understand that, of course, he is to have survived, which immediately draws in one of the key themes of Moby Dick: determinism or Calvinist double predestination. What is going to be is already predestined. And so in the sense of this book, there is an event in the future which is predestined, and everyone is being drawn towards it who is within this narrative. And that is the horror and the beauty of the book. And Melville wrote to his friend Nathaniel Hawthorne upon finishing Moby Dick, "I have written an evil book." And I believe that is truly what he's on about, is this convergent moment in the future which all the characters are being drawn towards, and that is the horror and the beauty of the book, in a sense, right? But the plot: Ishmael, he's this somewhat young nomadic figure. He's a bit of a loner, very typical for these sorts of novels, and he heads over to New Bedford in Massachusetts to basically, he wants to sign up for a whaling voyage for the simple fact of that young man, frontier spirit, adventurous spirit. I want to know what whaling's about. And he goes to an inn, and within the context of the time and the day where everything is set, this would be very normal. He's told by the landlord, well, you'll have to share your bed with a harpooner. Is that fine? He says, yeah. But it turns out the harpooner is a Polynesian man called Queequeg, who is emphatically a pagan and a cannibal, and he quite literally has a shrunken head. He is the archetype of an 1800s pagan put to paper, and yet we learn very quickly that our protagonist Ishmael is of a very noble heart. He's a good man. He is a good Christian because he sees in Queequeg that Queequeg's a noble man. He's a dutiful man. He's a good man, and so he's just open to Queequeg. But they are told to head over to the ships and see if there's a whaling vessel. And they go through a couple of ships, and then they come across the Pequod. And there is two of the ship's owners, Bildad and Peleg, and they say, well, you know, the true captain here is one of the most infamous figures in all of literature and one of the most interesting characters in all of literature, and someone I personally wouldn't describe as a villain, as he's often described, Captain Ahab. Captain Ahab is going to be basically the sort of the other one of the other. You sort of, in a way, you have three pivotal figures. If you were to emphasize the most important figures in the book, I would say it's Ishmael and his journey, Ahab and his pushing against fate, and Moby Dick, the which I would describe as the predestined clear event in the future. But Ahab, he is a grand, ungodly, godlike man. And the only way I can really describe Ahab is a quotation here, which is a speech from Ahab. And this is about midway into the book, so we're well underway of understanding Ahab's ferocity. "Speak, thou vast and venerable head," muttered Ahab, "which thou ungarnished with a beard, yet here and there lookest hoary with mosses. Speak, mighty head, and tell us the secret thing that is in thee. Of all divers, thou hast dived the deepest. That head upon which the upper sun now gleams has moved amid this world's foundations, where unrecorded names and navies rust, and untold hopes and anchors rot, wherein her murderous hold this frigate earth is ballasted with bones of millions of the drowned. There, in that awful waterland, there was thy most familiar home. Thou hast been where bell or diver never went, hast slept by many a sailor's side, where sleepless mothers would give their lives to lay them down. Thou sawest the locked lovers when leaping from their flaming ship, heart to heart they sank beneath the exulting wave. True to each other when heaven seemed false to them, thou sawest the murdered mate when tossed by pirates from the midnight deck. For hours he fell into the deeper midnight of the insatiate maw, and his murderers still sailed on unharmed, while swift lightnings shivered the neighbouring ship that would have borne a righteous husband to outstretched longing arms. O head, thou hast seen enough to split the planets and make an infidel of Abraham, and not one syllable is thine. So this is the captain that you have of your ship, and this is literally a speech that he's giving amidst the crew. And so this is the guy we're traveling with. This is Ahab. So we meet Ahab on the Pequod, and we're told they're going to go whaling, and they're going to do the usual thing of killing some whales, taking the blubber and the oil, and then bringing it back and selling it. And immediately there's this strange umming and ahhing about how much money Elijah, our protagonist, is going to get from the voyage. And immediately there, Bildad brings in, place your treasures up in heaven where moth and dust won't rust them, etc., etc. Because Ishmael is ultimately offered a 773rd, I believe, portion, but I think Peleg gets him about a 300th portion. But ultimately, Ishmael then tells us that a 300th portion will, okay, he's getting his board and his food on this fairly grim ship because it's going to be out for a long time. So board and food doesn't really amount to much in a certain sense because it's not going to be all that nice. And then by the time he's back, a 300 share would probably buy him some new clothes, which he's already ruined on the ship. You just pay him for your time, basically. And this is, so the ship, Elijah says, sure. He just wants to go whaling. He wants to experience, not Elijah, Ishmael. He wants to experience whaling. So he says, yeah, okay. And then they look at Queequeg and are you a Christian man? Are you a Christian man? But Queequeg, who is a harpooner and has his harpoon with him, instead of sort of defending his case, finds a very small target. I believe it's a bit of moss in the sea, and he hits it directly with his harpoon, and they immediately give him a 30th share. So immediately we understand what the priorities of the ship are, and it's, can you kill a whale? And there's just immediately within this book this strange moving away from the actual product, the actual economy of what, the why are we doing this? Why are we killing these whales? And the efficient and the productive answer is, well, we go out, we kill these whales, and we take their oil. So then we can bring it back and we can sell it, and we can light thousands of homes, we can make a bit of money, and we can make a bit of money for all the widows and orphans who also have shares in the ship from the dead sailors from before. But ultimately, this never really comes across at all. This isn't emphasized. When we see that with Queequeg's ability to hit the target, is they just want to kill. They want to kill whales. They want to kill whales like old buffalo hunters wanted to make sure that every buffalo was dead. They want to kill every whale in the sea. But to continue with the plot, and this is where many spoilers will come in, I will give a very, very bare bones overview of what the plot is. They set forth whaling. We meet Ahab, who is at first a very reclusive figure. We meet other strange people on the ship. An Indian, another pagan, a ship full of really hearty, hostile, violent, and hate-filled men. And then eventually the ship, by midway in the book, the ship is this vessel of madness, and the ship itself, the Pequod, is literally made up of whale bones. They are declaring their hatred for whales everywhere, and it's this sort of cannibalistic ship made up of madness, Ahab's hate, and mottled together, just roaming around trying to kill. And by the midway in the book, you're sort of it's an oddly terrifying vision. But they meet various ships on their way, who they have this relationship about Moby Dick, because Ahab immediately, have you seen Moby Dick? That's his first question. So it's this relationship with whatever it is that Moby Dick, as the whale, the great white whale, represents, that is of importance really between these ships. And eventually, huge spoilers here, eventually they do meet Moby Dick, and it's not really till right at the very end where this chase to Moby Dick happens, of course. And huge spoilers, Moby Dick destroys the Pequod, kills every single person except Ishmael, who is rescued by the Rachel, who in biblical terms is trying to find her lost children, and once again she simply finds another orphan. And that is the plot. But this leads me into, like, how is this book, why is, in a way, such a simple plot a vengeance against a singular figure, the whale, with a sort of naive young man as the protagonist? How is this carried forward in such a sense that the book is emphatically the definition of a masterpiece? And it's because the style is incredible, because the style is influenced by Shakespeare, Thomas Carlyle, and the Bible, but it's influenced, in a sense, oddly, considering Melville's personal Calvinism. It's influenced by the Old Testament, and then two books. You have the Book of Job, like the most sort of hate-filled book of the Bible, and then Ecclesiastes. These are the two books that in Melville's Bibles people find most noted, most underlined, and that clearly influenced, but the Book of Job most emphatically. So it's Shakespearean, it's biblical, and Thomas Carlyle as well, especially Sartor Resartus, which is also a great book. And Moby Dick and Sartor are often put together as two things happening at the same time. But Sartor is more unknown. Maybe I'll do a review of that sometime. But in addition to general narrative, narrative prose, you also have songs, poetry, encyclopedic catalogues of setology, quite literally almost copied and pasted from an encyclopedia, with Melville's own knowledge interspersed into them, like these just encyclopedic passages on whales. So as you're going along, you yourself are building this knowledge of a whale and of what a whale is and what the whale is they're trying to go towards and how mammoth and undescribable this thing is. And so as you go along, there's more and more of this knowledge, and eventually you almost feel like you know whales so well that you just can't wait to meet it. But alongside that, there's moments where Shakespearean stage directions suddenly come in, and we're into a play. There's soliloquies, and there's many other things. And it's for this reason that the style is, for me, what takes it away from just that common understanding of it as the whaling book, or a book about some narrative towards a whale. It's really the 1851 book which made everything which came after it not necessarily possible, because it's unfalsifiable as to whether or not that happened, but so I'll have to use that term loosely. But it's the book which made everything after it possible. It's, in a sense, like proto postmodernism, and some people would describe it as a very modernist book, and there's certainly true in the sort of archetypal man versus his singular vision, man versus Moby Dick, Ahab's hatred versus Moby Dick, Ishmael's journey of redemption, pride, etc. There's certainly modernist in that sense, but in many other ways, it's postmodernist. Absolutely. And the reason I say it's proto-modernist, because another book that is my long read at the moment, and eventually I will review probably in about 2 months, someone that would probably be considered proto-postmodernist is William Gaddis in the Recognitions, where it's like, well, this came before and we didn't recognize it at the time, so what's Moby Dick? And the reason I say about the postmodernism is largely because there is a ton of meta-textuality in the book. There's a ton of Melville nodding to you and saying, yeah, I know I've done that. And so we have to go beyond that because it's just too obvious. And this is where I'll try open out my reading of the book and just go into my free flow reading and by going into the characters. You have Ishmael, this nomadic, very open character. But before Ishmael and Queequeg venture onto the Pequod, this man Elijah comes out of nowhere. And of course, if you know your Bible, Elijah, probably one of the most famous story of Elijah. Elijah means my God is the Lord. That's what the name Elijah literally means. But we first meet Elijah in Kings in the Bible, where he suddenly appears to challenge King Ahab, who Captain Ahab is named after. King Ahab was a very evil king. He ruled sort of late 800s BC, and Elijah prophesies a drought to come upon the whole land as a consequence for Ahab's evil. And after 7 years of drought, Elijah has King Ahab. This is a story in the Bible. This isn't directly referenced in Moby Dick. Elijah has King Ahab bring 450 priests of Baal and 400 priests of Asherah to Mount Carmel. So he's basically, okay, bring your pagans, bring the best, bring all the pagan power you have. Let's go, right? And he issued a challenge. He built an altar to see which god set it on fire. And you have 900 pagan priests trying to get a response from Baal. And then Elijah built his, and nothing happens. And then Elijah builds his altar. He covers it in water. He says, okay, let's, you want to really see, covers it in water. And then after praying to God, fire came down from heaven and lit Elijah's water, even making the water burn. And then after this, he has all the priests of Baal killed. The dialogue which is going on with Elijah in biblical terms, and at the beginning of the story of Moby Dick, the dialogue that's going on is one of faith versus power, of, we could say, humility and submission to the truth and reality of the Christian God. I'm not trying to bring in my own thing here, but reading the book as I think Melville is writing it. It's the truth, the beauty, and the simplicity of the Christian God versus the power, the pride, and the worldliness of the pagan gods. And so in this story with Elijah versus King Ahab, you have this simplicity of, well, I have faith. Look at everything you need to bring. Look at what you're trying to do. You've got this power. You've got this worldly power, all this worldly pride, and all of your worldliness, all of these almost 1,000 priests amount to nothing against the simplicity of my hidden faith. But when you read the prophet Elijah in the Bible, what comes across in Elijah's prophecies, especially during his sections on Mount Carmel, is a simplicity. You know, he literally says things like, share your bread with the hungry. Okay, invite the homeless into your house. Elijah, and I mean this in a bit of a tongue-in-cheek way, the sections in the Bible of the prophet Elijah are those sections where it simply can't be reread to try, wangle it so you can get out of doing the charitable thing. And so why this is important, I believe, is just before Ishmael and Queequeg venture onto the Pequod, Elijah appears from nowhere, and he basically says, don't get on that ship. You don't need to get on that ship. Don't get on that ship. And for me, this is basically Elijah saying, that ship is pure hatred, pure power, pure pride. Look at you. You're trying to mark out a course. You're trying to mark out your own wills. And instead of saying, like, you have to go through that, you have to enter into it to try battle it in some, like, heroic, idealistic, spiritual battle sense, that many people do when they enter into spiritual life, and they don't realize they have that decision. Just don't get on the ship. You don't need to enter into it. You don't need to do that. It can be so much simpler than having this whole battle thing and then being proved wrong at the end. You just don't get on the ship. Of course, they do get on the ship because that's how things happened. So that's the beginning, really, of the main symbolic reading, I think, of the book, which is the allegorically biblical reading of the book. And this is, this is obvious. But what I think, the true horror of the book, and I think I maybe mentioned it already, but Melville writes to Nathaniel Hawthorne after he finished, he says, I have truly written an evil book. And this, I believe, is because it's a Calvinist book which is dealing with the Calvinist themes of the day, worries and anxieties of the day, which became big anxieties for many people, of double predestination, of determinism, and of your lot in life and where you will end up being determined. And so for me, Moby Dick, the whale and the symbol, these many, many things, but almost temporally, Moby Dick is a moment in the future which all these characters, Queequeg, Ishmael, Ahab, Starbuck, Stubb, and all his first mates, Flask, it's a convergent wave. There's an event in the future, and what we're seeing is each singular character's relationship with that event in the future and how they deal with it personally. But all the time, you going, wow, there is no way we get away from moving away from this event. And this, for me, is the great sadness of Captain Ahab. And this is why I don't, in a sense, consider him a villain, because he's absolutely just filled to the brim with hatred. And he has this singular thing: kill Moby Dick. That's it. The entire meaning of this man's life is kill Moby Dick, and he doesn't really care about anything until someone says, there she blows, and they see a whale, and that's for him. It's like, here's my moment. But the reason I don't consider him villainous is because beneath that is this sort of deep Calvinist sadness. At a certain point, he just says, "I'm a captain of fate," and he's accepted his determined future with respect to this event, and he knows, he's almost like a man who knows the path he's already been given, and so his hatred is almost towards both Moby Dick, but also a hatred towards Moby Dick as that thing he will never be able to avoid, and I think in a sense a thing that perhaps he even knows he will never destroy because it can't be destroyed. And in the sense Moby Dick can't be destroyed, that's why I think ultimately what this novel, what the what the massive or general underlying narrative of the novel which is really happening. Because otherwise, all this peculiar stuff coming together on a singular ship, which is why I read out that quotation of the suddenness of the sea and Melville's external notion of the sea, this chaotic, uncontrollable thing, and that with respect to our soul, is that I think the voyage itself and the eventual thing they get to, which is Moby Dick, is basically a narrative of redemption in the face of the greatest sin, which is pride. Everyone is dealing with pride in a Christian manner upon this voyage, except Ishmael, our protagonist, who, as this third party, from this third position, is viewing the ship, not necessarily objectively, but he's seeing perhaps how people are being drawn away. And the reason I think it's emphatically a novel of redemption is that you have the ship with the captain is named after one of the evil kings of the Bible. You have a pagan, a native Indian, and another pagan on board. You have people who are described in their physicality by a Christian temperament. You know, he was of a staunch Quaker temperament, or he's of a etc. etc. And it ends up being this ship, which is a collage and collection of multiple people, all whom would have a completely different relationship with redemption, dependent on what their own personal thing is. But of course, all their minor sins, in a way, gravitate towards this great sin of pride, which you can't destroy. And ultimately, you know, Moby Dick is often understood as the representation of pure evil. I think that's possibly true, who knows? But in the sense that he is pure evil, or, you know, the greatest sin and therefore one of the greatest evils is pride, you can't destroy it. And that's why I think that emphasis on Elijah before they get on the boat is actually of strict importance. Elijah is basically saying that is not going to end well, and it cannot and will not end well because it's been done. And it's been done time and time again. Someone going out to try to destroy evil, and instead of destroying it, maybe they overcome it in a little way, but they just end up being consumed and destroyed themselves because they didn't need to enter into that relationship with it. And that's sort of part of this character, Elijah, in Moby Dick's madness, is he seems to be someone who's seen this cycle repeat time and time again. Evil doesn't really win, it just stays out where it is, because Moby Dick strangely doesn't, you don't really know, you know, we can't give an agency, in a sense, to Moby Dick the whale. It's never really said, well, we think Moby Dick's doing it for this reason. Moby Dick's destruction of the men ultimately seems to come from the fact, well, you're lobbing harpoons into him. Why didn't you leave it alone? But you couldn't, because you're men and you're prideful, right? That's what pride is. You know what? No, I'm not having that. I have to go out there. I have to destroy it. And that's your own destruction, because you entered into a battle against something which just does not speak the same language as you. It's pure evil. You don't have the means to destroy this thing, and so you go out and you try kill it, and then it gets annoyed because you've just interjected yourself into something that you don't understand. And what happens? Ahab literally is almost consumed by the whale, and this is done actually really well in the 1956 film with Gregory Peck, which is a pretty good vision of Moby Dick on film, with Ahab sort of being as consumed into the whale as possible. And it's ultimately back to this notion of the soul amidst the sea. The sea is the uncontrolled, you know, to draw in someone like Michel Serres, the sea is uncontrollable. You can only ever be, you can be a good or bad sailor, but you can't be like an artificial sailor where on the sea you can just suddenly go, well, I'm going to go that way. The forces of nature, the wind, therefore the currents of the sea, the waves, and how that's all playing out, ultimately determines where you're going to go and how far you can go and how fast you can go and what you're going to do at all. You can be a good sailor and maybe, you know, veer off a little bit more, or you can be a bad sailor and get destroyed by the sea, but ultimately you're at the mercy of this huge expanse of water and uncontrollability. The whole novel, the horror of the novel is the determinism. Once you set out on that voyage, no, that's it. And there's moments, one of the most beautiful moments in the book is right near the end, where Starbuck, which is Ahab's first mate, they're constantly sort of falling out. Starbuck even at one point plots to shoot him, but it doesn't happen. It can't happen. It can't happen. You know all along that Ahab's not going to die that way. It has to end with this clash of the event which was always there and the people coming towards it. But they're falling out, and there's this beautiful, beautiful moment between them where they're on the smaller whaling ships going out to meet Moby Dick. And I think this is on the end of the first day of the chase, where finally Starbuck, almost in tears, they settle their differences, and they sort of have this acknowledgement of this was always going to happen. We both know this was always going to happen, and they shake hands, and Ahab sort of gives him an acknowledgement of, thanks for accepting my fate as well. And it's an acceptance of fate, and perhaps Ishmael's strange place within it all is he's saved, but he's saved because he doesn't seem to be. He enters the novel as someone who just wants to investigate the world. He's fairly naive and ignorant, whereas everyone else who's on the ship has these pretty clear cut. His fate is drawn along by an investigation in the fates of everyone else. He's very open-hearted, and he's a good man. And this, that's what I have to say about Moby Dick, is that it's often put alongside another novel that I consider a modern masterpiece, which is Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. And they're often put alongside each other. Some people have put them as, like counterparts to the same discussion. But there is this overwhelming discussion of nature and determinism with respect to nature, and that was always going to happen. And people being drawn into forces of nature, which they don't fully understand themselves, and they either allow themselves to be completely overcome by it and become almost possessed like Judge Holden, or be something else like Judge Holden, who was often thought of as being a djinn, a jinn, which is like a sort of demon type thing. Or you try battle it, and the battle's you're not gonna win. And you see this as well in Blood Meridian. You go up against the Glanton gang, you're not gonna win. They have a commune with a force of nature. And Ahab, in trying to make himself God, and in never giving himself over to anything higher, he's never going to win, because he's in the realm of God. The sea is pure determinism. He's in God's realm, and he's trying to battle it. He's trying to win. It's not going to win. And this is why, when you go back to that first quotation about the strange analogy to something in yourself, the appalling ocean surrounds the verdant land. So in the soul of man there lies one insular Tahiti, full of peace and joy, but encompassed by all the horrors of the half-known life. God keep thee, push not off from that isle, that thou canst never return. And it's almost as if that Ishmael, our protagonist, he was naively pushed. He had to leave the garden out of some sort of pure ignorance that wasn't his fault, and then he's forgiving, he's very sorry, but the rest of them, they thought they could venture off that island, and thou canst never return, and they don't return. And it's the big question, I think, in a way. It's a Calvinist question, it's a temporal question, it's a biblical question, and it's a question of redemption with respect to Ishmael's character as to why he is saved. That's the big question of the book. Why is Ishmael saved? And I think really, in a sense, why you could say Melville's book, Moby Dick, is extremely progressive is because I personally think one of the reasons that Ishmael is saved, and this is very ahead of its time for Melville to do this with respect to his Calvinist, personal Calvinist beliefs, is because he doesn't really judge Queequeg. There's a little bit at the start when he says, "Oh, cannibal," and then they just talk, and he's like, "Oh, okay, this guy's fine." He doesn't, and once that's done, he's walking around with Queequeg and they're best buddies. He doesn't really judge. He doesn't really judge people all that much. He's happy with whatever. He's eventually fine with the small amount of money that he's getting for the voyage, And he's living a Christian life. And I think it's Ishmael's compassion and open-heartedness which leads him to be saved. It's a pretty generic and mundane reading of the book, but equally the horror is that doesn't mean he's escaped the determinist line. That was part of his fate at all. That was part of his fate all along, was simply to be saved. And I think perhaps Melville's quote to Hawthorne in saying, "I've written an evil book," is the fact that he's very distinctly outlined in mythical and almost unconscious terms what it would mean to truly internalize and accept a divine determinism of that sense. You know, like just falling into the sea and accepting one's fate. And this is the most interesting section of the book for me, and it's literally 2 pages long. There's a small cabin boy called Pip, and due to someone else's illness or injury, he has to go out on one of the whaling boats, and due to the intricate descriptions of things that Melville gives, you understand why when a harpoon is launched into a whale that can easily knock someone off the boat, Pip, this young boy, cabin boy called Pip, gets knocked off the boat, and before he knows it, it's a mile out from the whaling boats and a mile out from the Pequod. He's in a mile round circumference, I guess, of open sea, and the horrors of the open sea. He as this young lad internalizes his complete and utter powerlessness, and he goes mad. He's not raving lunatic mad, but they say after that he was never the same. He basically became very dumb and just stayed in the lower deck because he sort of, he'd looked into what it is to give yourself over to that and to know too much of it. And that is the horror of Moby Dick, is witnessing people time and time again to try push against something they could never push against, to try overcome something that always already was never going to be overcome, to try kill something which cannot be killed. Those are my thoughts on Moby Dick. Be sure to get the unabridged edition, because otherwise it's just a completely different book. But I hope you're enjoying these reviews, and thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the next one.